All right, so we are beginning Thomas Taylor's dissertation on the philosophy of Aristotle. We'll be doing this publicly because I don't believe there's an audiobook for this text. I started it at one point and I thought it was interesting, so I figure we will share this and make it more accessible. And we've been with the Timaeus commentary of Proclus, kind of commenting on top as we go, and I think that makes it a little bit more digestible if you are just listening to it. So hopefully you find this helpful. We will go ahead and start right at the beginning. This is through the Mathematicoi group of the reading groups that we do, and we're kind of restarting. We did the Organon, and now we're going back to this overview of Aristotle's philosophy. From here, we will do some kind of logical text outside the Organon, and then probably go back into categories again with commentary. So that's what's in store for this group. But yeah, this is the kind of reset of that whole program. So here we go. A dissertation on the philosophy of Aristotle, Book 1, Chapter 1. Among the prodigies of genius who have largely benefited mankind by disseminating philosophy, Aristotle maintains a very distinguished rank, when we consider that he was not only well acquainted with every science, as his works abundantly evince, but that he wrote on almost every subject which is comprehended in the circle of human knowledge, and this with the most consummate accuracy and skill. We know not which to admire most, the penetration or extent of his mind. For capacious indeed must that mind have been, which embraced the vast orb of existence and left nothing unexplored in the heavens or the earth, and penetrating that genius which arrived at the luminous boundaries of human knowledge, and rendered them accessible to others. With a bold yet not impious hand, he appears to have withdrawn the awful veil of nature herself, to have detected her most secret mysteries, and ranged through every part of her variegated dominions. In short, he seems to have possessed and to have exercised the power of reasoning in the greatest perfection possible to man. And such of his works as have escaped the ravages of time will ever be considered by the genuine lovers of science as treasures which from their singular excellence are destined to perish in no less a catastrophe than that of a deluge or conflagration. Just making the text a little bigger. And I'll have to adjust over here. All right. To unfold the principal dogmas of the philosophy of this sublime genius, to prove that his philosophy has not been understood since the destruction of the schools of the philosophers by the Emperor Justinian, and to detect and expose the fallacy and nothingness of what has been called philosophy since the time of the Greeks, is the design of the present dissertation. As preparatory, however, to the development of his principal dogmas, it will be requisite to present the reader with a division of his works, to show what the end of his philosophy is, and which of his writings leads us to this end, what kind of diction he employs, why he designedly wrote with such obscurity, and to evince that his principal doctrines are conformable to those of Plato, and that he differs from his divine master in appearance only, and not in reality. So reconciling Aristotle and Plato had been a project of several Neoplatonists. I guess Porphyry, gets the ball rolling to some extent in that direction. But Simplicius and Ammonius, the later pagan Neoplatonists, did this to an extreme. So like Simplicius's commentary on the categories has a lot of interesting things to say along these lines here as well. Like, why did Aristotle cloak the true nature of his philosophy? Why was it so easy to misinterpret him? And we'll probably revisit that commentary. It was a pretty epic one, which is crazy for such a short work. I think it was like 300 pages or more. And the categories is like, 15 pages? Okay. Of his remaining works, therefore, some are theoretic, others practical, and others instrumental. Likewise, of those treatises which are entirely theoretic or contemplative, some are theological, as his Metaphysics, others physical, as his 8 books inscribed Physical Osculation, and the books consequent to these, such as those on the heavens, on generation and corruption, etc., and others again are mathematical, such as his mechanical problems and his treatise on indivisible lines. In like manner, with respect to his practical writings, some are moral, as his Nicomachean and Eudemian ethics, and those which are inscribed the great morals, or they are economical and political, as the treatises which are thus inscribed. Lastly, of the books which are called instrumental, some are on the art of demonstration, as his posterior analytics, others respecting things which precede a knowledge of the demonstrative syllogism, as his prior analytics, his treatise on interpretation and his categories, and others again are respecting things which often become the subject of demonstration, or are subservient to it, such as his topics, his sophistical elenchi, or sophistical syllogisms of contradiction, and his books on the art of rhetoric, and such is the summary and universal division of the writings of Aristotle. In the second place, the end of Aristotle's moral philosophy is perfection through the virtues, and the end of his contemplative philosophy a union with the one principle of all things, for he scientifically knew and unfolded this principle, as is evident from the 12th book of his Metaphysics, in which he clearly pronounces that the domination of many is not good. The common end, however, both of his moral and contemplative philosophy, which man ought to pursue, is the last and most perfect felicity of which our nature is capable, and at the end of his Nicomachean ethics, he testifies that he who arrives at this felicity ought not to be called a man, but a god. All the works of the philosopher lead us to the attainment of this end, for some of them unfold to us the art of demonstration, others that we may become virtuous instruct us in morals, and lastly others lead us to the knowledge of natural things, and afterwards to those luminous beings which have a supernatural subsistence. In the third place, with respect to his diction, it is of that kind that the words may adhere to the sense and the sense to the words, a mode of writing both intellectual and admirably adapted to the profundity of his conceptions. For he either immediately gives a solution to a doubt, or connecting many doubts, he briefly solves all of them by one and the same solution. He is likewise never willing to deviate from evidence, which being produced either by intellect or sense, he especially adduces and celebrates the latter when he disputes with those who in everything consider sense as the standard of truth. Hence there is such an irresistible strength in his demonstrations that when he cannot persuade by assumptions not rationally introduced, he at least procures assent by the force of necessity. This, too, is peculiar to Aristotle, that he was never willing to depart from nature, but even contemplated things which transcend nature through a natural habit and knowledge, just as, on the contrary, the divine Plato, after the manner of the Pythagoreans, contemplated whatever is natural, so far as it partakes of that which is divine and above nature. Hence, the former considered theology physically, and the latter physics theologically. He likewise never employs fables and enigmas, and never ascends into the marvelous and the mystic, but adopts obscurity of diction as a substitute for every other veil and involved mode of writing, the reason of which we proposed to investigate as the fourth object of inquiry. Those more ancient than Aristotle, thinking that it was not fit to expose their wisdom to the multitudes, instead of clear and explicit diction, adopted fables and enigmas, metaphors and similitudes, and under these, as veils, concealed it from the profane and vulgar eye. But the Stagirite praises and employs obscurity of diction, and perhaps accuses and avoids philosophical fables and enigmas, because some interpreters may be given of them by anyone, or rather some interpretation may be given of them by anyone, though their real meaning is obvious to few. Perhaps, too, he was of opinion that such obscurity of diction is better calculated to exercise the mind of the reader, to excite sagacity, and produce accurate attention. Certain indeed it is that the present fashionable mode of writing, in which every author endeavors to adapt every subject to the apprehension of the meanest capacity, has debilitated the understanding of readers in general, has subjected works of profound erudition to contempt, merely because they are not immediately obvious, and as if the highest truths were on a level with the fictions of romance, has rendered investigation disgusting whenever it is obtruse. That this obscurity, however, in the writings of Aristotle does not arise from imbecility, which he will be obvious to those who are but moderately skilled in rhetoric. For such is the wonderful compression, such the pregnant brevity of his diction, that entire sentences are frequently comprised in a few words, and he condenses in a line what Cicero would dilate into a page. His books on meteors, his topics, his politics, likewise evince that he was capable of writing with perspicuity as well as precision. And among his lost works, Simplicius informs us that his epistles and dialogues were most elegantly written. Indeed, says he, none even of the most illustrious writers is equal to Aristotle in epistolary composition. Okay. Does someone else want to take over?
Sure. In order to show, fifthly, that Aristotle accords with Plato in the principal dogmas of his philosophy, I shall adduce in the first place what he says at the end of his Physics, where he terminates the doctrine concerning natural principles in supernatural theology, as in a summit, and evinces that the whole of a natural and corporeal composition is suspended from an incorporeal and intellectual goodness, which is above nature, and without any habitude to inferior beings. Having therefore demonstrated of the first mover that he is one, immovable, and without parts, he mentions as follows the third of these positions. These things, therefore, being determined, it is evident that it is impossible for that which first moves and is immovable to have any magnitude. For if it possessed magnitude, it is necessary that it should either be finite or infinite. But that it is impossible there should be an infinite magnitude has been before demonstrated in the Physics, and that a finite magnitude cannot have an infinite power, and that it is impossible for anything to be moved in an infinite time by which is finite, has been just now demonstrated. But the first mover produces a perpetual motion, and in an infinite time. It is evident, therefore, that he is indivisible, without parts, and has no magnitude. Simplicius justly observes that Aristotle, in what is here said by him, accords with Plato. But he adds, Plato discovers the intellectual God, the artificer of the world, from the essence itself of the mundane body, for separating true being from that which is generated. He defines the former by a perpetual and invariable sameness of subsistence, as being allotted an essence, the whole of which is established at once and together, without interval and impartibility, in eternity, but asserts that the latter has its subsistence in becoming to be, or rising into existence, as being changed and moved, and having its existence coextended with the circulations of time. On this account also, it is suspended from its cause as incapable of being self subsistent. For it is perfectly impossible, says he, that it should be generated without a cause. But the cause of that which is generated is true being, lest admitting that there is something generated prior to that which is generated, we should proceed to infinity, and for the same reason, the immutable is the cause of that which is mutable. Plato, therefore, in the Timaeus, discovers the demiurgus of the world, who is truly an intellectual God, and is always established in eternity, with an invariable sameness of subsistence, recurring from the mutable essence of the world to its immutable cause. But Aristotle, from the motion and mutation and the divisible and finite subsistence of bodies, ascends to an immovable, immutable, and indivisible cause. For he demonstrates that it is necessary there should be a perpetual motion in beings, and consequently, that there should be something which is perpetually moved, since motion is in that which is moved. He also demonstrates that everything which is moved by something, and that the first mover is necessarily immovable, and the immutable cause of perpetual motion to the natures which are proximately moved by it.
So these are the famous arguments from the metaphysics about the first cause. They also appear like similar arguments in Plato's laws, but that's a late composition. So, I mean, it's even possible that Aristotle was the author of this argument for first mover. But yeah, a very similar argument is there in the laws as well.
Cool. Uh, but the generation with Plato and motion with Aristotle signify mutation. We may easily learn from this that Plato divides that which is generated as being changed, oppositely to that which possesses an invariable sameness of subsistence. But that Aristotle, when he says everything which is moved by something, speaks not only about things which are properly moved, but also about such as are generated and corrupted, and in short, such as are changed. In many places, also, he says that the immovable is immutable, for it not only surpasses motion properly so called, but also generation and corruption. But it appears to me that this wonderful man clearly refuses to apply the term generation to things perpetual, because the fantasy easily supposes that things which are said to be generated have a temporal beginning. And in this manner, indeed, the multitude are affected, not being able to coextend their conceptions with perpetual fabrications, but adding a temporal beginning to that which is said to subsist from a cause and to be generated. They also appear to understand with facility, if any one supposes a beginning, middle, and end of the fabrication of things. The greater part of the wise, too, looking to that which may be easily understood by their readers, in this manner fabricate the world, asserting that things first, second, and third were generated. And perhaps these wise men think they may be pardoned in so doing, since theologists also do not refuse thus to unfold the generations of the gods, adapting their conceptions to the capacity of their readers. But Aristotle, perceiving, as it appears, that the multitude always erroneously understand such assertions, and conceive at the same time a temporal beginning, could not endure to speak of the world as being made, and clearly refuses to call things perpetual generated. Hence, he uses the word motion, which signifies the same thing as generation, but does not require a temporal beginning. Indeed, that he does not refuse the term generated when applied to things which have their beginning in infinity is evident from the third book of the Physics. When speaking of the infinite, He says, since to be is multifariously predicated as a day and a contest, is consequence of another and another being always generated, so likewise the infinite. The beginning of the demonstration, therefore, is with both philosophers the same, leading from the mutable to the immutable. But afterwards, the one says that everything which is moved by something, and the other that whatever is generated has its generation from a cause. And the one demonstrates that the first mover is immovable, immutable, and without parts, but the other that the cause of that which is generated, which is true being. That, however, which is without parts, the whole of which is at once, and which possesses an invariable sameness of subsistence, is a thing of this kind, and which indeed the being perfectly immutable signifies. Since, however, some are of opinion that Aristotle asserts the first mover, which he celebrates as intellect, eternity, and God, to be alone the final, but not the producing cause of the world, and especially of the heavens, which he frequently says are perpetual, and on this account unbegotten, and that he moves as the desirable, it will be well to show that in this also he accords with his preceptor, who asserts divinity not only to be the final, but also the producing cause of the heavens and of the whole world. Plato, then, in the Timaeus, when he says, let us relate through what cause the composing artificer constituted generation and this universe, he was good, etc., evidently asserts divinity to be both the final and producing cause of the world. And also, when he says placing intellect in soul and soul in body, he fabricated the universe that it might be the most beautiful and the most excellent work according to nature. And nearly through the whole dialogue, he celebrates the demiurgus as looking too good. In the speech also of the demiurgus to the celestial gods, he clearly shows that the demiurgus himself proximately produces celestial natures, but sublunary through the celestial. For the first demiurgus says to the junior or celestial gods, gods of gods, of whom I am the demiurgus and father. And in the course of his speech, he adds, three genera of mortals remain, but these not being generated, the heaven will be imperfect. Now, dealing with the world, now calling the world heaven, in the same manner as Aristotle. He proceeds, but it is necessary that these should be generated if the world is to be sufficiently perfect. These, however, being generated by me and participating of life, will become equal to the gods. In order, therefore, that mortal natures may exist and that this universe may be truly all, convert yourselves according to nature to the fabrication of animals. But the words, these, however, being generated by me, manifest that if they were generated by a cause which possesses an invariable sameness of subsistence, or as Aristotle would say, by an immovable cause, they would necessarily be perpetual, and and that Aristotle indeed asserts that God, or the first mover, is the final cause of the world, is doubted by no one. That he also admits him to be the producing cause appears to be sufficiently evident from his asserting in the division of causes in the second book of the Physics that producing the producing cause to be that whence the principle of motion is derived. Again, he says, it is that whence the first principle of mutation or rest originates. Thus, he who consults is a cause of this kind, and a father of his child, and in short, the maker of that which is made. What assertions, therefore, can more perspicuously manifest than these that the first mover is a producing cause? In the first book of his treatise on the heaven, he clearly says that neither God nor nature make anything in vain. And in the same book, he says that eternity derives its appellation from subsisting always, being immortal and divine, whence also being and life are imparted to other things, to some more accurately and to others more obscurely. But it is evident that as all things partake of good through the final cause, so likewise they are and live through the demiurgic cause. In his first book, too, on generation and corruption, he evinces that the first mover is a producing cause. When investigating the causes of perpetual generation, he thus writes, but there being one cause whence we say the principle of motion is derived. And this, as we have before observed, is according to Aristotle a producing cause. And matter, continue quote, and matter also being one cause, the former must be said to be a cause of this kind. For of this cause there is one such cause immovable through the whole of time, and another which is perpetually moved. Aristotle therefore asserts that the producing cause is twofold, the one immovable, which is the cause of all things, but the other perpetually moved, or the celestial orbs, which is the cause of sublunary natures. In the first book, likewise, of his Metaphysics, praising Anaxagoras, and prior to him, Hermotimus, as not only assigning the material causes of the universe, but also beholding intellect as the producing and final cause, he thus writes, he therefore who asserted that as in animals, so also in nature, intellect is the cause both of the world and of all order, will appear like one sober when compared with those Antians that spoke rashly. Having observed, therefore, that Anaxagoras, and prior to him Hermotimus, mentioned a cause of this kind, he adds, those, therefore, who entertained this opinion, together with establishing a principle of things, which is the cause of their subsisting in a beautiful manner, established also a principle which is the cause of motion to things. Hence, he praises those who admitted intellect to be a final and producing cause, just as a little before he praised Anaxagoras, because asserting intellect to be the principle of motion, he preserved it impassive and unmingled.
Okay, so Hermotimus of Clazomenae from Wikipedia flourished 8th or 7th century BC. So that's before even Thales. Was a possibly historic or legendary pre-Socratic philosopher about whom many legendary feats were ascribed in antiquity, including the ability for his soul to leave his body and travel around. Some ancient sources also considered him a previous reincarnation of Pythagoras. Okay, that's interesting. Aristotle also credited him with some of the metaphysical doctrines on nous that were more commonly attributed to Anaxagoras. Okay. Historicity, best evidence for Hermotimus's potential historical existence is a tradition that the people of Clazomenae erected a temple for him, which is related by Pliny the Elder, Lucian, Apollonius, and Plutarch. Okay. Philosophical views. According to Aristotle, prior to Anaxagoras' idea of mind being fundamental in the cause of change, Hermotimus proposed that physical entities are static, while reason causes the change. Okay, I like that. Interesting. So, like temporal B theory, basically. Sextus Empiricus places him with Hesiod, Parmenides, and Empedocles as belonging to the class of philosophers who held a dualistic theory of a material and an active principle being together the origin of the universe. Lucian called him a Pythagorean. And here's just one last little bit. A legend. Laertius records a story that Pythagoras remembered his earlier lives, one being Hermotimus, who had validated his own claim to recall earlier lives by recognizing the decaying shield of Menelaus in the temple of Apollo at Branchidae. Tertullian relates a story about Hermotimus in which Hermotimus's soul would depart his body during sleep as if on a trip. His wife betrayed the oddity, and his enemies came and burned his body while he was asleep, his soul returning too late. Wow. It's a rough way to go. These philosophers need to choose their wives more carefully, like Socrates and Xanthippe. Although arguably that benefited Socrates, he had to learn how to be patient. But okay. Maybe Ed, you want to pick up?
I can do that. Checking, yeah, my mic is on. If someone, however, should inquire why Aristotle does not so evidently assert God to be the producing as he does that he is the final cause of the world, in answer to this, what was before said concerning a generated nature must now be repeated. For since that which makes that which is generated, and that which is generated appears to co-introduce a temporal beginning of generation. On this account, Aristotle refuses even to call perpetual bodies generated, though he frequently and clearly denominates the cause of them, a producing cause. And perhaps, if it should be said, that the terms generated and to make are properly adapted to things in generation and corruption, which co-introduce a partial time. Other appellations are to be used in speaking of perpetual natures, and we may observe, indeed, that Aristotle does not refuse to call motion perpetual, though motion has its being in becoming to be, or in rising into existence. But he does not choose to assert of it perpetual generation, because that which is generated appears to be generated, not existing, for and again tends to corruption. In the next place, it is requisite to observe that though Aristotle with such apparent violence opposes Plato's doctrine of ideas, yet he in reality accords with this doctrine, for that he was not an enemy to the dogma that in intellect of the fabricator of all things there are forms or ideas, which presubsist as paradigms and as the productive principles of whatever has a perpetual subsistence in the universe, is evident from hence. That in the 12th book of the Metaphysics, he asserts that there is a twofold order, one in the world and another in the cause of the world. Just as we say that there is one order in an army, and another in the commander of the army. But where there is order, there must necessarily be separation, and things which are disposed. Orderly disposed. If anyone, however, defines the order which is in the universe, this order cannot certainly accord with that which is in the intellect of the demiurges, and consequently the appellation of the one must be discordant with that of the other. Aristotle, therefore, not enduring those conceptions of ideas, which together with sensible appellations introduce definitions that comprehend in themselves a physical and material nature, refuses to call the causes of man and horse, man itself and horse itself, but is not averse to the first cause being called by pure names, such as good, essence, life, intellect, and energy. If then it should be said that these subsist in the divine intellect, but that they are not such as those which the sensible regions contains, it may reasonably be contended that the same assertion may be made respecting man and horse, and everything else of similar kind. Aristotle, therefore, was in general averse to causes receiving the same appellations with their sensible effects, and this was the peculiarity of his philosophy and the reason why he opposes with such apparent hostility to the friends of ideas.
Right, okay. So, Aristotle in the Metaphysics, talking about the unmoved mover as thought thinking itself, indicates that there are like paradigms of created things in the mind of God, essentially. So, similar to Plato's demiurge. But he wouldn't admit that there are things like the form of man, of horse. There are forms, particular, distinct types of intelligibles, but we shouldn't just assume that every corporeal type has a corresponding, eidos associated with it. Or if it does, then we shouldn't call it exactly the same as the generated thing. So I've heard this idea that Aristotle treats thought thinking itself in a similar way to the demiurge, and that gives Aristotle's philosophy something like the theory of forms. But I hadn't seen this concept that basically Aristotle wanted to reduce the number of these arches or paradigms and call them by things that differ from sensible objects. So, this is raised also in the Parmenides, like whether it's appropriate to believe that there are forms of mud, forms of, every last type of material thing. There's not a firm answer on that explicitly, but then the way that Parmenides goes through the division, demonstrating the dialectic, he looks at very high level forms like sameness, otherness, being, non-being. So it seems like, in a way, Aristotle was just like following the critique within the Parmenides itself of the kind of naive theory of forms. You could say that Socrates is portrayed as having a kind of naive theory of the forms, and then there's like an indication of a deeper Eleatic and Pythagorean like science of those first principles. So okay, this is cool. Let's go on to chapter 2.
Let us now direct our attention to Aristotle's apparent opposition to Plato in his treatise On the Soul. The design of Aristotle, then, in this treatise is to examine the opinions of philosophers prior to or contemporary with him respecting the soul, to approve of whatever may be truly asserted, and to detect whatever may not be delivered according to the accustomed use of names, lest receiving the opinions of the ancients conformably to these, we should be deceived. Plato, therefore, gave the name of motion to the life of the soul, in consequence of its being evolved and being neither in every respect partible nor remaining purely impartible, denominating also such a life motion from its declination from an impartible nature, and asserting that the essence of the soul is self-movable as being essentialized according to such a life. Hence, through the word movable, he indicates the subordination. Subordinate. Okay, it's a subordination than donation. That's funny. Of this life to an impartible nature, but by the word self, its permanency in the impartible, and a life at the same time abiding in and proceeding from itself. But Aristotle, being accustomed to give the name of motion to that nature alone, which is partible and is numbered according to continuity, conformably to the common use of the word, not only denies motion of the psychical essence, but does not appear to admit that the soul is in any way moved by itself. Thus, too, Plato calls the transition, which is produced through the energy of the soul motion, such as is to consider and consult, and indeed, he denominates the regression of the soul from an intelligible and impartible essence, motion, but Aristotle alone calls that transition motion, which is successive and continued. It is evident, therefore, that here also the difference between the two philosophers is in a name only and not in things. Again, it was usual with the Pythagoreans to philosophize symbolically through the mathematics about things supernatural, those pertaining to the soul and such as are physical. Plato also assuming the person of the Pythagorean Timaeus, as he exhibits him ascribing the 5 right-lined solid figures to simple bodies, so likewise he represents him unfolding the essence of the soul of the universe through right and circular lines, in order that he may at the same time indicate its middle nature, between an essence indivisible and that which is divisible. About bodies, just as a line also is the middle of a point, and of solids, and its proximate subordination to intellect, and farther still, he might indicate by this its undeviating progression, proceeding from itself, which a right line signifies, and through a circular inflection, the conversion to itself, just as through the habitude of one right line to two, and again of a more inward habitude to 7, it indicates the causal comprehension of the celestial spheres according to an appropriate middle.
So he's just summarizing how in the Timaeus we have this kind of number symbolism, seems like, or mathematical symbolism generally. So it's getting a little bit confused. Gavin? Hello? Your hand was raised, but then you're muted. Okay. Alright. Well, he dropped that, so never mind. I'm going to go ahead and pick up for the rest of it.
Okay.
For this comprehension does not subsist like intellect impartibly, but after the manner of soul with evolution. Of the circular lines are a symbol, just as the motion of these lines is a symbol of psychical life. For though intellect moves the heavens, yet it is in conjunction with soul, which through its peculiar evolved life as a middle produces the impartible motive energy of intellect into the continued and partible energy of the heavens, which energy alone Aristotle denominates motion, and opposes Timaeus as attributing to the soul an energy divisible and attended with interval, lest we, following the accustomed use of names and conformably to this, receiving what is asserted by Plato, should form an opinion that the soul is either a certain magnitude or is corporeally moved. Right, so Plato, his definition of motion is wider. Aristotle wants to restrict it essentially to corporeal motion. That's what Taylor seems to be saying here. Gavin, you raised your hand before. Do you want to say something, or maybe there's some phone issues? Or all right, keep going. It is evident also that the connection of the soul with the body must not be considered locally, but according to the proximate and essential presence of it through the whole of the body. Right? De Anima, Aristotle treats the soul as essentially the form of the entire body. Okay. But the composition of it from the elements manifests its completion from essence, sameness, and difference. And in short, so those are the ingredients from the Timaeus that go into the world soul. And in short, its possession in common of the constitutive peculiarities of beings, so far as beings. This likewise being appropriately assumed in the soul, for all beings consist from all such things as are common, but each appropriately according to the order which it is allotted. Okay, so just saying all is in all, but appropriately in each, I believe here. Again, the division according to harmonic numbers indicates, so those are the numbers that the demiurge uses in constructing the world soul. He takes the same essence and difference and blends them, and then gets certain like proportions in constructing these circles out of them in fashioning the soul. But the proportions are all proportions used in like the Pythagorean scale. So 2/3, 3/4, like 9/8, and such. That indicates the hypostasis or subsistence of all reasons in the soul. And the mode of the subsistence, viz. Declining to separation and being collected into the impartible, and on this account divided according to the harmony of numbers. For harmony, through the collection of symphony, is indicative of reasons established according to different peculiarities, for numbers are significant of peculiarities. Pythagoreans treated like not quantitative numbers, but like the kind of mystical numbers in the background, treated those as kind of the way Platonists treat the forms. So numbers are the basis of all things. So here, in constructing the soul, the different numbers used, deriving these different proportions, signify the different kind of peculiarities or powers that go into the soul. And the fact that they're all harmonic numbers indicates that a whole is being generated or collected. The soul of the world, however, by her inherent reasons, moves the heavens with a harmonious lation, and knows the harmony which subsists in nature superior to and subordinate to herself. Okay. Because these reasons are conjoined to superior natures according to continuity, and are the causes of subordinate natures, so that the celestial circulations are produced through the evolved life of soul. Okay. Aristotle, therefore, demonstrating that the soul is incorporeal and that she has an energy not divided according to continuity, confutes the assertion that she is moved circularly after the manner of corporeal magnitudes, for such a motion is adapted to bodies as being essentialized according to interval, but by no means to soul, and especially to the soul of the universe. So I think the gist is that in the Timaeus, there's number symbolism, just like the Pythagoreans used, and Aristotle denied that the soul was a number, thinking that like quantitative number was being meant there, and the same with motion. So it's like motion and number meant higher things for Pythagoreans and Plato than Aristotle was willing to admit to them. So the seeming difference on those points is a matter of language. That's Taylor's idea here. Okay. So this is a little bit difficult to follow overall. Like the kind of old-timey language doesn't make it easy, and Taylor's thought process is somewhat like he brings in things that I wouldn't necessarily expect, and I'm not always seeing how they're all connected. But it's going to be a lot of interesting stuff. Taylor, translated so much of Aristotle and Plato and Neoplatonists. He was kind of like the greatest expert on Platonism and Aristotelianism of his time. So we should definitely, be on the lookout for any of his comments. All right. Any last thoughts for today?